You just spent your last $450 to fix a boiler I explicitly ordered you to ignore. Victoria Croft's voice cut through the howling Chicago wind, sharper than the 1-2-degree air. She stood in the snow-covered courtyard of the Apex residential complex, wrapped in a $1,000 cashmere coat, glaring at a man shivering in a thin maintenance jacket. Hand over your keys, Michael. Security's on the way for trespassing. Michael Thomas, 38 years old, stood frozen, not just from the sub-zero temperature, but from the crushing weight of what had just happened. He had a wife at home with multiple sclerosis, $8,400 in credit card debt, and exactly $32 left in his checking account. But last night, when Atez, 2-year-old Mrs. Higgins called, lips blue from the cold in her rent-controlled apartment, Michael made a choice. He bought the pressure valve himself. He saved her life. And for that, he was being destroyed. What neither Victoria nor Michael knew was that a man standing quietly in the shadow of Unit 4B was watching every second of this exchange. If saving a human life meant losing the roof over your own family's head, would you look the other way? Or would you cross that line? Have you ever had to pay a devastating price just for trying to be a good person? The man watching from Unit 4B is about to make Victoria Croft pay an even heavier one. 48 hours earlier, the alarm clock buzzed at 4:30 a.m. in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the south side. Michael Thomas sat on the edge of the mattress, the springs groaning beneath his weight. He didn't turn on the overhead light. He didn't need to. The harsh, artificial glow of his smartphone screen illuminated the deep lines etched into his 8-year-old face. He was staring at a banking app. The numbers on the screen weren't just digits, they were the exact dimensions of his prison. Available balance, $482.14. He swiped to the next screen. Credit card balance, $8,400. Michael locked the phone and walked into the small kitchen. He opened the refrigerator to get the milk, but his eyes bypassed the food and landed immediately on the bottom shelf. Lying next to the vegetables was a small, white box of Copaxone injections. His wife, Sarah, had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis 3 years ago. Her immune system was slowly eating away at the protective covering of her nerves. The medication kept the worst of the relapses at bay, allowing her to still walk, still smile, still hold his hand. But the copay after the grueling battles with their insurance provider was exactly $1,200 a month. Out of pocket, every single month. Michael worked as the senior maintenance technician for Apex Management. His wage was $18.50 an hour, before taxes. If you do the math, you realize very quickly that Michael wasn't living. He was simply surviving, holding his breath underwater, praying the surface wouldn't move further away. He needed this job. More specifically, he needed the corporate health insurance policy that came with it. Without Apex Management, Sarah's medication would cost nearly $6,000 a month. Without Apex, his wife would end up in a wheelchair by Christmas. That single, terrifying fact was the chain that kept Michael tied down. It was the reason he swallowed his pride. It was the reason he woke up every morning and drove to a workplace that was slowly eating his soul. The Apex residential complex was a massive, brutalist brick structure built in the late 70s, housing over 300 units. To the outside world, it was just another lower middle-class housing block. But on the inside, it was a finely tuned machine designed for extraction. At the top of this machine sat Victoria Croft, the regional director. Victoria was a 2-year-old executive who treated property management not as a service, but as a blood sport. She arrived every morning at 8 a.m. in a pristine white Lexus, stepping into the crumbling lobby wearing Louboutin heels that clicked against the worn linoleum like the ticking of a metronome. She didn't care about the peeling paint, the flickering hallway lights, or the rattling pipes. Victoria only cared about the spreadsheet. Apex had recently been acquired by a massive, faceless private equity firm. The mandate from corporate was simple: increase quarterly revenue by 20%, or lose your position. But in a building filled with working-class families and elderly pensioners, you couldn't just raise the rent. Many of the older tenants, like 8 2-year-old Mrs. Higgins in Unit 2C were protected by legacy rent control laws. Mrs. Higgins had lived in that apartment for 40 years. She paid $750 a month. If Victoria could get her out, that same apartment could be slapped with a cheap coat of gray paint, fitted with laminate flooring, and put back on the market for $2,400 a month. But you can't legally evict a tenant who pays her rent on time. So, Victoria utilized a different strategy. A dirty, quiet, entirely deniable strategy. She called it the freeze out. The protocol was unspoken but rigorously enforced. Whenever a maintenance request came in from a rent-controlled unit, Victoria would intercept the work order. A broken water heater, a cracked window, a malfunctioning radiator. If the tenant was paying market rate, the repair was approved instantly. If the tenant was rent-controlled, the work order went into Victoria's pending tray. Mark it as waiting for parts from the supplier, Victoria would tell Michael, without looking up from her mahogany desk. Tell them there's a supply chain issue. Tell them whatever you want, but do not fix it. Her goal was attrition. Make the living conditions so unbearable, so miserably cold and broken, that the elderly tenants would voluntarily pack their bags and move into assisted living or go stay with relatives. She was literally trying to freeze them out. But the cruelty didn't stop there. Victoria wasn't just ambitious. She was greedy. Every time she ordered Michael to ignore a broken boiler, she would log into the procurement system and generate a fraudulent invoice. She would report to the corporate office that Apex had hired a third-party contractor to replace the expensive heating valves. Corporate would release the funds. The phantom contractor, a shell company registered to Victoria's brother-in-law, would cash the check, and Victoria would pocket the difference. She was getting a bonus for reducing operational costs, while simultaneously stealing the maintenance budget. And Michael knew everything. He saw the fake invoices sitting on the printer. He heard the phone calls behind her closed office door. But most agonizing of all, he was the one who had to look the tenants in the eye and lie to them. At 10 a.m. that morning, Michael was standing in the hallway of the second floor, carrying a useless toolbox. The temperature outside was dropping rapidly, a brutal Chicago winter storm gathering on the horizon. The door to Unit 2C cracked open. Mrs. Higgins stood there, wearing a thick wool sweater over her nightgown, her frail hands trembling as she held onto the doorframe. Her breath plumed in the freezing air of her own living room. "Michael?" Her voice was thin, fragile, like dry parchment. "Did the parts come in yet, sweetheart? It was so cold last night, my joints. They ache so much when the cold gets into the bones." I tried calling the front office, but no one answers. Michael stood there, the heavy steel of his wrench burning a hole through his work gloves. In his pocket was the key to the boiler room. In his truck was a universal pressure valve that would take him exactly 15 minutes to install. He could fix her radiator right now. He could give this 2-year-old woman warmth. But he could feel Victoria's eyes on him, burning from the security camera at the end of the hall. He remembered his $482 bank balance. He remembered the $1,200 medication sitting in his fridge. If he fixed the radiator without authorization, Victoria would fire him on the spot for insubordination and misuse of company property. He would lose his health insurance by the end of the week. Sarah would miss her injections. The system was perfectly designed to pit the survival of the working class against the survival of the vulnerable. It weaponized Michael's love for his wife, turning it into a tool to oppress an old woman. Michael swallowed hard. The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Higgins," he muttered, unable to meet her watery eyes. "The supplier is backed up. The parts are stuck in transit. I can bring you an extra space heater from the basement, but I can't touch the radiator yet." Mrs. Higgins offered a sad, understanding smile that broke Michael's heart into 1,000 pieces. "It's all right, Michael. I know you're doing your best. Thank you." She closed the door. The sound of the latch clicking into place echoed in the freezing hallway like a gunshot. Michael walked back to the elevator, his chest tight, his hands shaking. This was the cost of his survival. Every paycheck he brought home was stained with the suffering of the people he was supposed to help. The silence wasn't just keeping him employed. It was systematically eroding his soul, stripping away his dignity piece by piece. He didn't know how much longer he could live with himself. He didn't know that the worst winter storm of the decade was only 24 hours away. And he didn't know that standing quietly by the stairwell, holding a small notebook and watching the entire interaction, was the new tenant from Unit 4B, a man named David Caldwell, who hadn't said a word, but who had seen exactly how the Apex machine operated. The storm was coming, and the breaking point was finally here. The tipping point didn't come disguised as a corporate memo. It came as Winter Storm Carter, a brutal, merciless blizzard that slammed into Chicago with 60-mile-per-hour winds and temperatures that plummeted to negative 12 degrees Fahrenheit. By 3 p.m. on Thursday, the city was paralyzed. By 4 p.m., the massive, aging boiler in Building D of the Apex complex gave out with a violent, metallic shudder followed by a terrifying, hollow silence. 50 rent-controlled units were instantly cut off from heat. At 4:15 p.m., Michael's radio crackled. It was the front desk. "Mike, we've got a dozen calls from Building D. It's freezing in there. Mrs. Higgins from 2C just called." She sounded bad. "Mike." She said the water in her glass is turning to ice on her nightstand. Michael sprinted to the basement of Building D. One look at the rusted, blown-out pressure valve told him everything. The system was dead. It required a commercial-grade replacement valve, one he knew a 2-4-hour industrial supply store across town had in stock for $450. He ran to Victoria's office, bursting through the door without knocking. "Victoria, Building D's main boiler is dead," Michael said, his breath heavy. "We need to authorize a $450 emergency purchase for a pressure valve right now. The temperature inside the units is dropping by the minute." Mrs. Higgins' lips were blue the last time the desk checked on her. Victoria didn't stop typing on her laptop. She didn't even look up. "Log it in the system as waiting for parts from Europe," she said, her voice entirely devoid of inflection. Michael froze. "Victoria, it's negative 12 outside. The wind chill is negative 25. They have no heat." She finally stopped typing, slowly raising her eyes to meet his. Her gaze was as empty as a predator's. "I said, log it. Let the old hag freeze. A few nights in the icebox, and by the weekend, she'll be packing her bags and begging to break her lease. The unit will be empty by Monday." "She's 82 years old!" Michael's voice cracked, rising in desperation. "She won't survive the night in there!" Victoria leaned back in her plush leather chair, perfectly warm in her climate-controlled office. "Then the unit frees up even faster, doesn't it? Do your job, Michael, or find another one. Now, get out of my office." That night, Michael sat in the dark of his apartment. The wind screamed against the thin glass of his living room window. In the bedroom, his wife Sarah was sleeping, her breathing shallow. In the refrigerator, the box of MS medications sat, waiting for its refill next week. He pulled out his phone. Available balance, $482.14. The pressure valve cost $450. If he bought the valve with company money, Victoria would catch it instantly and have him arrested for theft. If he bought it with his own money, he would have exactly $32 left. Sarah's copay was due in 5 days. If he defied a direct order, he would lose his job. He would lose the health insurance. The disease would begin to ravage his wife's nervous system all over again. It was the ultimate, agonizing moral test. The system had backed him into a corner where doing the right thing was indistinguishable from destroying his own family. He sat there for an hour, staring at the wall, but every time he closed his eyes, he didn't see his bank account. He saw 8 2-year-old Mrs. Higgins, wrapped in a thin sweater, her fragile hands shaking as the frost crept up her walls. A man who lets an innocent woman freeze to death just to save his own skin, Michael thought, is a man who is already dead. At 1:15 a.m., Michael quietly grabbed his coat. He drove his beat-up truck through the blinding blizzard, sliding on the black ice, until he reached the 2-4-hour industrial supply warehouse. He stood at the counter, his hands shaking, not from the cold, but from the terrifying weight of what he was about to do. He inserted his debit card into the reader. Processing proved. New balance, $32.14. At 2:30 a.m., Michael slipped through the side entrance of Building D like a ghost. He descended into the freezing, pitch-black boiler room. His flashlight clamped between his teeth. He went to work. The frozen metal burned his bare hands, slicing into his knuckles as he wrestled with the massive wrench. But he didn't stop. He fought the rusted pipes, pouring every ounce of his desperation, his anger, and his humanity into turning that wrench. At 3:15 a.m., a beautiful, hissing sound echoed through the basement. The pipes shuddered. Steam rushed through the lines. The massive boiler roared to life, a dragon waking from its slumber. 3 floors up, in Unit 2C, Mrs. Higgins, huddled beneath 3 blankets and shivering violently, felt a sudden, miraculous wave of warm air wash over her face. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer into the dark. But no good deed in a corrupt system goes unpunished. At 8 a.m. the next morning, Victoria's pristine white Lexus pulled into the snow-covered courtyard. Before she even stepped out of the car, she checked the remote telemetry app on her iPad. Building, 72 degrees. Her jaw clenched. She marched straight into the maintenance bay, where all 6 technicians, including Michael, were preparing for their shifts. She spotted it immediately in the trash can, the empty cardboard box of a brand new commercial-grade pressure valve. She turned to Michael. The courtyard was silent except for the howling wind. This brings us back to the moment where it all shattered. You just spent your last $450 to fix a boiler I explicitly ordered you to ignore, Victoria spat, her voice dripping with venom, loud enough for the entire staff to hear. She didn't take him into an office. She wanted a public execution. She wanted every other worker to see what happened when you chose a conscience over compliance. You think you're some kind of savior, Michael? She stepped closer, her Louboutin heels crunching in the snow. You're not a savior. You're a liability. You are a disobedient, pathetic liability. Michael stood his ground, though his heart was pounding against his ribs. There are people in there, Victoria. Human beings. They are numbers on a spreadsheet, she screamed back. She reached out and violently yanked the company ID badge off the lanyard around his neck. You are fired. Effective immediately. Your corporate health insurance is terminated as of midnight tonight. Have fun paying for your sick wife's medication now. Michael felt the blood drain from his face. The world seemed to tilt beneath his feet. And if you ever step foot on Apex property again, Victoria added, her lips curling into a cruel, triumphant smirk, I will have you arrested for trespassing, and I will personally sue you for unauthorized tampering with corporate infrastructure. Pack your locker. You have 5 minutes. 10 minutes later, Michael walked out of the Apex complex carrying a small cardboard box containing a thermos and a few worn screwdrivers. The blizzard raged around him. He had no job. He had no insurance. He had $32 to his name. He had sacrificed everything to do the right thing, and the universe had rewarded him by crushing him into the freezing pavement. But as Michael trudged away through the deep snow, his head bowed in absolute defeat, he didn't notice the man standing quietly just inside the glass doors of Building A. David Caldwell, the silent tenant from Unit 4B, had watched the entire public execution. He had heard every single word Victoria Croft had said. And as he watched the best man in the company walk away into the storm, David slowly pulled a sleek, encrypted smartphone from his coat pocket and dialed a private number in New York. The trap was set. The beast had taken the bait. And hell was about to freeze over for Victoria Croft. To understand how a perfect trap snaps shut, you have to rewind the clock. 7 days before Winter Storm Carter buried the city in ice. 7 days before Michael Thomas was stripped of his livelihood in the snow. If you had walked through the courtyard of the Apex residential complex that week, you might have noticed a new tenant. Or, more likely, you wouldn't have noticed him at all. That was the point. He resided in Unit 4B. His name on the mailbox read David Caldwell. He was a quiet, middle-aged man, who drove a faded green 2012 Honda Civic that sputtered when it started. He wore a frayed, olive drab corduroy coat that looked like it had been bought at a thrift store a decade ago. He didn't talk much to the neighbors. Instead, he spent hours sitting on the frost-covered wooden bench near the main entrance, his collar pulled up against the biting wind. He just sat there, watching, and every so often, he would pull a small, black moleskin notebook from his pocket and write something down with a cheap ballpoint pen. Victoria Croft had walked past him at least 4 times that week. She never made eye contact. To a predator like Victoria, a man in a frayed coat driving a 12-year-old Honda was invisible. He was a non-entity, a ghost. But Victoria's arrogance was her fatal blind spot, because David Caldwell did not exist. The man sitting on the freezing bench, quietly logging the license plates of the phantom contractor vans that never arrived, was Richard Vance. Richard Vance, 55 years old, was the founder and CEO of Vanguard Horizon Holdings, a $40 billion private equity firm based in Manhattan. And 3 weeks ago, Vanguard Horizon had acquired the parent company of Apex Management in a massive, all-cash buyout worth $400 million. Richard was a man who had built his empire by knowing exactly what was happening in the darkest corners of his investments. During the final stages of the due diligence process for the Apex acquisition, his risk assessment algorithms flagged a series of strange anomalies in the Chicago region. The operational costs were suspiciously low, yet the turnover rate for maintenance staff was exceptionally high. But what truly caught Richard's attention was a buried, heavily redacted file containing dozens of anonymous tenant complaints. The complaints detailed horrifying living conditions: elderly residents left without heat in the dead of winter, water pipes bursting and being left to rot. A lesser CEO would have dispatched a team of corporate auditors in expensive suits to investigate, but Richard knew how the corporate game was played. If he sent auditors, regional directors like Victoria Croft would simply sanitize the books, intimidate the staff, and put on a flawless performance. Spreadsheets can be manipulated, invoices can be forged. To see the truth of a system, you cannot look at it from the top down. You have to stand at the absolute bottom. You have to feel the cold yourself. So, the billionaire CEO created a ghost. He signed a short-term lease under a pseudonym, parked a burner car in the lot, and moved into Unit 4B. For 7 days, Richard Vance lived inside the nightmare Victoria Croft had built. He felt the paralyzing chill of the freeze-out. He listened to the hollow, rattling pipes in his own walls. But more importantly, he watched the people. He watched Victoria strut into the crumbling lobby in her red-soled Louboutins, sneering at the residents whose rent paid for her luxury car. He documented her exact arrival and departure times. He recorded the dates when she claimed third-party heating specialists were on-site days when Richard sat on his bench and verified that not a single commercial vehicle ever entered the gates. And, crucially, he watched Michael Thomas. Richard noted the heavy, dark bags under the maintenance worker's eyes. He saw the torn fingertips of Michael's work gloves. He secretly observed Michael staying 2 hours past the end of his shift, off the clock, sneaking heavy electric space heaters from the basement storage up to the 4th-floor apartments of the elderly residents. Richard saw a man whose spirit was being crushed under the weight of an impossible moral burden, yet who still refused to completely let go of his humanity. Then came the night of the blizzard. When the main boiler in Building D violently ruptured at 4 p.m., Richard was in his unit. As the temperature inside his apartment rapidly plummeted from 60 degrees to 40, then to 35, Richard didn't call the emergency line. He simply put on his coat and waited. He wanted to see exactly how the Apex machine would respond to a life-or-death crisis. He didn't have to wait long to find out. The system's response was absolute silence. But at 2:30 a.m., Richard heard the heavy steel door of the basement creak open. Stepping silently out of his apartment and descending the concrete stairwell, Richard moved like a shadow. He stood on the landing, completely hidden in the darkness, and looked down into the freezing, cavernous boiler room. There, illuminated only by a flashlight clamped between his teeth, was Michael. Richard watched in profound silence as the maintenance worker, shivering violently, his knuckles scraped and bleeding against the rusted iron, wrestled with a massive commercial pressure valve. Richard knew exactly how much that valve cost, and he knew, having audited the regional budgets himself, that Victoria had never authorized the purchase. The CEO stood in the freezing dark and realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. While the regional director slept in a warm, luxury townhouse, actively plotting to freeze her own tenants, a desperately underpaid maintenance man was spending his own money and breaking his own back in the middle of the night to save them. When the boiler finally roared to life, sending a massive surge of life-saving heat through the building, Richard didn't reveal himself. He simply retreated to his notebook, writing down the final, damning pieces of evidence. Which brings us back to the snow-covered courtyard, the public execution. When Victoria Croft stormed out of her white Lexus the next morning, screaming about a fixed boiler, Richard Vance was already there. He was standing near the edge of the courtyard, blending perfectly into the small crowd of terrified maintenance workers and shivering tenants who had gathered to watch the commotion. He stood with his hands deep in the pockets of his frayed corduroy coat. His face was an unreadable mask of calm. He listened as Victoria shrieked about numbers on a spreadsheet. He watched her violently rip the ID badge from Michael's neck. He heard her weaponize the illness of Michael's wife, terminating his health insurance with a sadistic smirk. Victoria Croft thought she was the apex predator in the yard. She thought she was playing with her food, crushing a weak, insignificant bug beneath her designer heel. She had absolutely no idea that she was bleeding out in a shark tank. She had no idea that the quiet, unremarkable man standing just 20 feet away from her owned the ground she was standing on, the building behind her, the company she worked for, and the very desk she sat at. Richard watched Michael Thomas pack his small cardboard box and walk away into the blinding snow, stripped of his dignity and his livelihood. The billionaire did not intervene. Not yet. A simple firing wasn't enough for Victoria Croft. Reversing Michael's termination wasn't enough. Richard didn't just want to correct the mistake, he wanted to entirely obliterate the corruption at its root. He wanted to make an example so terrifying that no property manager in his portfolio would ever dare look at a tenant as a mere spreadsheet number again. As Michael's figure disappeared into the whiteout of the storm, Richard Vance slowly pulled a sleek, encrypted satellite phone from the inner pocket of his coat. He hit a speed dial number. It rang once. "Vanguard Legal. This is Harrison." A crisp voice answered. Richard's eyes remained locked on Victoria, who was now laughing with her assistant as she walked back toward her heated office. "Harrison, it's Richard," the CEO said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "The audit is complete. I need the Federal Fraud Division, local law enforcement, and our entire executive termination team at the Apex Chicago complex by 3 p.m. today." "Understood, sir. Are we restructuring?" Richard's gaze turned colder than the ice beneath his boots. "No," he replied. "We are bringing the hammer down. 3 p.m. The grand lobby of the Apex complex. The air inside the lobby was thick with tension, colder than the blizzard rattling the windows outside. Victoria Croft stood on a makeshift stage, a marble podium usually reserved for holiday decorations. She looked radiant in a new Armani suit, a glass of sparkling water in her hand, looking down at the crowd of 300 residents like a queen surveying a rebellious colony. She had called this emergency town hall for one reason: to crush the spirit of the residents once and for all. "Listen up, everyone," Victoria's voice amplified through the PA system, echoing off the high ceilings. "I know some of you are upset about the minor heating fluctuations last night. And I know some of you are concerned about the departure of our former maintenance lead, Michael Thomas." She paused, a thin, cruel smile playing on her lips. "Let this be a lesson in reality. This building is private property. It is a business. Michael Thomas was terminated for theft and gross insubordination. He chose to play hero with company resources, and now he is gone. If any of you feel that the conditions here are unbearable, let me make this very simple. You are not prisoners. There is the door. If you can't afford the market rate, or if you can't handle a little Chicago chill, leave. Otherwise, keep your complaints to yourselves and pay your rent on time." The room was silent. Mrs. Higgins, sitting in the front row, wiped a tear from her eye. The residents looked at the floor, defeated. They knew they had no power. They knew the law was on the side of the person with the most expensive lawyer. Victoria leaned into the microphone, her voice dropping to a hiss. Does anyone else have something to say, or can we get back to, I have a question? The voice was quiet. It wasn't a shout. It was the calm, steady tone of a man who was used to being heard. The crowd parted as a man in a frayed olive-drab corduroy coat stepped forward. David Caldwell, the quiet tenant from Unit 4B. Victoria squinted, her eyes brimming with annoyance. Mr. Caldwell, isn't it? The man who drives the car that leaks oil on my pavement? Look, David, I don't have time for a lecture on your leaky faucet. Sit down before I have security escort you out for disturbing the peace. Richard Vance, still wearing the disguise of David, stopped 10 feet from the podium. He looked up at her, and for the first time, Victoria felt a strange, cold shiver in her spine. It wasn't the weather, it was the look in his eyes. They weren't the eyes of a struggling tenant, they were the eyes of a judge. Actually, Victoria, Richard said, his voice resonating through the hall, I'm not here to talk about a faucet. I'm here to talk about the $400,000 you've diverted into a shell company called Croft & Associates over the last 18 months. I'm here to talk about the fraudulent invoices for boiler parts that were never ordered. And I'm here to talk about the reckless endangerment of 300 lives during a federal weather emergency. Victoria's face turned a strange shade of gray. She let out a forced, high-pitched laugh. What are you talking about? You're delusional. Security! Get this man out of here. 2 burly security guards started toward Richard. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. He simply reached into his frayed coat and pulled out a sleek, black smartphone. He tapped a button. The PA system didn't play music. It played a recording. A crystal clear recording from 48 hours ago. Log it in the system as waiting for parts from Europe. Victoria's voice boomed through the lobby. Let the old hag freeze. The unit will be empty by Monday. The lobby went deathly quiet. The residents gasped. Mrs. Higgins let out a sharp sob. Victoria froze. Her hand began to shake, the water in her glass spilling onto her Armani jacket. That's a deepfake! That's illegal! Who the hell do you think you are? Richard reached into his pocket again. This time, he didn't pull out a phone. He pulled out a heavy, leather-bound wallet. He flicked it open. Inside wasn't a driver's license. It was a gold-rimmed corporate credential embossed with the seal of Vanguard Horizon Holdings. My name is Richard Vance, he said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the weight of a god. I am the chairman and CEO of the company that owns this building. I am the man who signed your last 3 bonus checks. And as of 30 seconds ago, I am the man who has officially dismantled your life. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a world ending. Victoria's glass slipped from her fingers. It shattered on the marble floor with a sound like a gunshot. She tried to speak, but her throat had seized up. She looked at the man in the frayed coat and finally saw him. She saw the billionaire. She saw the shark. You're David, she whispered, her voice trembling. David Caldwell is a ghost, Richard replied coldly. I've lived in Unit 4B for a week, Victoria. I've felt the ice on the walls. I've seen the fake invoices. And I watched you destroy the best man on this payroll because he had the audacity to be a human being. At that exact moment, the heavy glass doors of the lobby swung open. 6 men in dark windbreakers with FBI emblazoned in yellow across the back marched in, followed by 4 uniformed Chicago police officers. They didn't go for the residents. They didn't go for the guards. They marched straight to the podium. Victoria Croft, the lead agent asked, "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and multiple counts of felony reckless endangerment. You have the right to remain silent." As the handcuffs clicked shut around Victoria's wrists, the checkmate was complete. The mask was gone. The regional director was gone. In her place stood a terrified, broken woman whose face had lost every drop of its arrogance. As the officers led her down from the podium, she had to walk through the gauntlet of the people she had oppressed. She passed Mrs. Higgins. The old woman didn't scream. She didn't curse. She just looked at Victoria with a quiet, devastating pity. The crowd, which had been paralyzed in shock, suddenly erupted. It started as a murmur, then grew into a thunderous, floor-shaking roar of cheers and applause. It was the sound of 300 souls finally being able to breathe again. It was the sound of justice, long delayed but finally delivered. Richard Vance stood in the center of the storm, his face calm. He watched them lead her out into the blizzard, into the back of a cold steel police van. Then he turned to his assistant, who had just arrived with a thick stack of folders. "Bring Michael Thomas back here," Richard ordered. Now, the dopamine hit was undeniable. The bully was in chains, the king was on his throne, and for the bus stop at 79th Street was an island of misery in a sea of gray snow. Michael sat on the frozen bench, his cardboard box resting on his knees. He checked his phone. One new notification from his pharmacy: "Your prescription for Sarah Thomas is ready for pickup. Total due, $1,200. Michael looked at the screen, then at the $32 in his wallet, and finally at the falling snow. He didn't cry. He didn't have the energy left for tears. He had done the right thing. He had saved Mrs. Higgins. But as he sat there, he wondered if the universe even cared. He wondered if being a good man was just a slow way to drown. Suddenly, a sleek, black SUV pulled up to the curb, its tires crunching the slush. The rear window rolled down. "Michael, get in. It's too cold for a walk." Michael looked up. It was the man from 4B, David. But he wasn't wearing the frayed corduroy coat anymore. He was wearing a charcoal wool overcoat that cost more than Michael's truck. "I don't have time for a ride, David," Michael muttered. "I need to go find a new life." "David Caldwell is gone, Michael," the man said, his voice carrying an undeniable authority. "My name is Richard Vance. I'm the CEO of Vanguard Horizon, and we have a lot to talk about." 10 minutes later, Michael found himself back at the Apex office. But the atmosphere had transformed. The security guards who had watched Victoria Lung nuke him were now standing at attention. Victoria's office was being stripped. Her mahogany desk was being cleared by men in suits. Richard Vance sat on the edge of the desk, gesturing for Michael to sit. "I watched you for 7 days, Michael," Richard began, his eyes locked onto Michael's. "I watched a lot of people this week. I watched Victoria prioritize a quarterly bonus over human lives. I watched other technicians look the other way because they were afraid. But then I watched a man with $32 in his bank account spend his last penny to save an old woman he didn't even know." Richard leaned forward. "The world is full of people who are qualified, Michael. I have thousands of employees with Ivy League degrees and perfect resumes. But those people are common. Integrity? Integrity like yours is the rarest commodity on earth." Richard pulled a folder from the desk. "I'm not giving you your old job back, Michael. That position is beneath you. As of this afternoon, Apex Management's regional structure is being liquidated. We are rebuilding it from the ground up, starting with this complex. I am appointing you the new Regional Director of Operations." Michael's heart skipped a beat. "Director? Richard, I'm a maintenance man. I fix pipes. I don't know how to run a region. I can hire an accountant to teach you how to read a spreadsheet, Michael," Richard said firmly. "But I can't hire someone to care about Mrs. Higgins. I need a leader who understands that a building isn't just an asset, it's a home. Your starting salary will be $180,000 a year with a full performance bonus structure." Michael stared at the floor, his vision blurring. But Richard wasn't finished. "And I've seen your insurance file," Richard added softly. "Vanguard's executive health plan covers 100% of MS treatments. No copays, no battles with providers. Starting today, Sarah will have the best care in the country. You never have to choose between a boiler and your wife's health ever again." Michael put his face in his hands, and finally, the dam broke. He wept not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming, soul-shaking shock of a man who had walked through hell and suddenly found himself in the light. 1 year later, the Chicago winter had returned, but the Apex complex didn't feel like a prison anymore. Michael stood in the courtyard, wearing a warm, professional coat, holding a clipboard. Beside him, a team of young technicians, men he had personally hired based on their character, not just their toolkits, were finishing the installation of brand new, high-efficiency boilers in every building. There were no more freeze-outs. There were no more fraudulent invoices. Michael walked up to Unit 2C and knocked. Mrs. Higgins opened the door. Her apartment was a cozy 74 degrees. She looked healthy. She looked happy. "Hello, Michael," she beamed, handing him a tin of warm cookies. "The radiator is humming like a bird today." "Just doing my job, Mrs. Higgins," Michael smiled. As he walked back toward his office, Michael looked up at Unit 4B. It was occupied by a new family, now a young couple just starting out. The ghost was gone, but the change he had sparked was permanent. Michael had realized that while systems are built by the greedy, they are maintained by the silent. But once one person refuses to stay silent, once one person decides that their dignity is worth more than their paycheck, the entire machine begins to change. The cold Chicago wind still blew, but the frost didn't creep up the walls anymore. Kindness hadn't just won, it had become the new standard. The screen fades to a soft winter sunset. The music shifts to a deep, resonant cello melody. Kindness in a corrupt system always has a price. Sometimes, it requires you to bet your entire livelihood on a single choice. But darkness can never truly hide the light. If Michael's story today reminded you of someone who is quietly doing the right thing, despite the cost, share this video with them. Let them know that their integrity is seen. Let them know that they are not alone in the cold. Leave a comment below about a time you stood up for someone else, even when it was inconvenient. And don't forget to subscribe to join us for the next awakening story. Because power isn't about how much you can take, it's about how much you refuse to let them take from you.